The Solitaire series, Episode 16, The Five of Spades, by Troy Lambert. Narrated by Troy Lambert. Copyright 2020. Audio copyright 2025. Las Vegas was founded in the 1800s, but really became a city in 1905. The name is actually Spanish for the Meadows, because it was a stopover on the rail line from Salt Lake to Los Angeles, because there was an abundance of artisan springs in the area. Water in Las Vegas. But two real changes are what shaped Vegas into what it is today. The first was the huge influx of young men into the area in 1931 when the construction of the Boulder Dam started. Never heard of the Boulder Dam? That's because it's known as the Hoover Dam now. That caused a bunch of hotels, casinos, and what such Wild West communities called support industries to arise. You know what I mean. Most of those casinos were run by the mafia, and that ain't no surprise, I'm sure. That's when Solitaire got their start, even though that wasn't their name back then. The second change came in 1966, when a guy named Howard Hughes showed up. Maybe you've heard of him. That's when Las Vegas was transformed into what is now known as a mega-resort community that's all family-friendly, supposedly. The support industries that built the town largely went quasi-underground. That meant that most people knew they were there, but pretended that wasn't what Vegas was all about. Sin City tried to clean up its image. Lucky, or unlucky for Solitaire, of that I will let you be the judge, that's when the Vietnam War really ramped up, and some colonel came up with a great idea to scare Charlie, planting the Ace of Spades cards in villages the army had decimated, kind of like a warning sign that made the Viet Cong superstitious about the cards. There was a deeper purpose, though. There were treasures of all types around at that time. Some of them were man-made, like caches of arms, American and those stolen from the enemy and buried in the jungle or sent back to the States. But there were others. Gold, jewels, riches beyond imagination. That's not to mention the opium trade. At that time, while young American soldiers were dying face down in the jungles of Southeast Asia or committing atrocities at the behest of their superiors that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, Solitaire was building an empire. And they weren't the only ones. Everyone connected got rich. Richer than most of you can imagine, I would guess. But I'll let the story speak for itself. Las Vegas, November 1969. You ever seen anything like that, Captain? You knew, soldier, he answered. The men were both clad in fatigue bottoms and brown t-shirts, their army blouses and covers hanging on a peg in the hangar. The back of the C-130 aircraft was open, and there were 4 pallets on the concrete floor. The ceiling was hidden high above, and the metal walls did little to insulate the area from the surrounding heat. Outside the open hangar doors it was dusk, and the temperature would drop quickly, but for now both men were sweating profusely. The pallets were filled with refined heroin ready to be handed over to their contact. The captain, known as Chuck to his men outside of the Army unit, glanced at the pallets. The soldier, although new to this game, was right. This was the largest shipment he had seen so far. Grab that pallet jack, specialist. We'll need to get this loaded as soon as the truck arrives. In the distance, Chuck heard a motor, and it sounded like the diesel of a deuce and a half, a 2.5-ton military vehicle that would not look out of place on this remote airfield. He'd sold this one after some creative paperwork allowed him to remove it from government inventory. This was a dirty business, but it had gotten him off the front lines and doubled his yearly salary. It turned out the American government wasn't above being involved in this sort of thing. War was expensive. But they'd also made it clear, if he got caught, he was on his own. If he stopped giving them their cut, he would get caught. And he paid whoever he recruited into the game out of his cut. Chuck didn't intend to ever get caught. Careful was his middle name, and as a supply officer, the military had taught him how to move things covertly and efficiently. The headlights came first, swinging in a wide arc through the hangar, illuminating the plane and the pallets, and then pointing out into the night before they shut off as the truck backed in under the right wing of the aircraft. The engine died, and 4 men jumped from the back, heading for the pallets. "Whoa," Chuck told them. "Money first, then product." The men stopped and stared at him. Chuck could feel the specialist step up beside him. "But we have orders to—" I don't care, Chuck said. He saw the soldier reach for his sidearm, a Colt M1911. He reached out a hand, stopping him. No, he said softly. Be ready, but wait. The passenger door of the truck groaned open, and Chuck heard another man coming, boot falls echoing off the concrete of the hangar. When he became visible, Chuck sized him up. Not a small man himself, at just over 6 feet tall, Chuck seldom found himself looking up at people, but this man had to be close to 7 feet tall. His shoulders were broad and tapered down to a thin waist. He wore a jacket that hung on him in an odd way, since it fit in the shoulders, but was much too large elsewhere. He wore a leather driver's cap, but his head appeared to be shaved bald underneath. A gold earring decorated his left ear. He held out his large brown hand. You in charge here? He asked. Chuck took his hand and shook it the best he could, feeling oddly small and weak. He wanted to answer, no, clearly you're in charge. Instead, he said yes. Do you have the passcode? Chuck reached into the cargo pocket of his pants. He saw the 4 men around the pallet tense as his hand went past the butt of his own pistol, but relaxed as he pulled out a deck of cards. I was told this would do. He handed the deck up to the larger man, who opened the pack. He slid out the cards, smiling when he saw them. He spread the deck out into a fan, holding it in place with his large hand. Pick a card, any card, he said, but don't show it to me. Chuck reached out and took one. You too, the man said, looking at the specialist, but don't show it to him. Okay. The other soldier's hand shook as he reached out and took one. The deck quickly folded, and the man stepped back, performing a quick and clearly experienced shuffle. Come here, he commanded one of the men near the pallet. The man walked over slowly, cautiously. The deck fanned out again. Take a card and stand next to them. The new arrival obeyed. Chuck looked left and right. He liked it when these transitions were quicker. He made a handoff, money was exchanged, the drugs went away, and he went home. The plane continued on its journey the next morning, a little lighter, and everyone involved a little richer. This made him nervous. It was taking too long. The large and apparently perceptive man stared at him. Relax. Ain't nobody coming tonight. We got you protected. Chuck nodded. Okay. You trust me? Sure, Chuck answered, not meaning it. Good, the man said, eyeing him. Glad to hear it. Now all 3 of you show me your cards at the same time. On 3. 1, 2, 3. Chuck held out his card, and the other 2 men did the same. He looked first at his, then left and right at the 2 men on either side of him. Every card was the 5 of Spades. The man laughed and then turned around the fan deck so they could see it. Every single card was identical. Didn't matter which card you picked. They're all the same. I see, Chuck said. I don't think you do, the man said. In fact, I'm sure you don't. Well, thanks for sharing, Chuck said. Can we get on with it? Sure, the man said. He gestured for the one he'd called over to return to the others. Get them pallets loaded. The money? I got your money, but I'm going to offer you the deal of a lifetime. Oh, yeah? Yeah, you keep the card, the one in your hand, and he can keep his too. He motioned to the young specialist with his chin. Or I'll give you the money. Your choice. You've got to decide which one is more valuable. Chuck took the card, turned it over in his hand, examining it. It appeared to be just a normal one. He couldn't see any marking or anything that would set it apart from any other playing card. It's just normal, he said. It doesn't seem to be worth a thing. So you've decided? Chuck hesitated. He had money, that was for certain. When the war was over and this pipeline, however it worked, dried up, he would retire and live a life no army officer could possibly afford. But this was a real gamble. He turned the card over and over, staring at it. Either the giant was bluffing, and this card was indeed worthless, or it was incredibly valuable. Hold on, he said. I don't want to set a precedent. This is a one-time deal, right? The next shipment will be normal? Right. I shouldn't even be offering you this one-time special, the man cackled. Not laughed, cackled, and that confused Chuck even more. I'll take the card, he said quickly. Me too. The soldier behind him started, but the big black man snatched the card from his hand. Only one man gets the deal. Good call. The specialist stared at him. I still need to get paid. That's his problem, the man said. The four men worked quickly, and soon the truck was pulling into the night, its lights turning on as it roared away. Chuck slid the card into his pocket. What about my pay? The specialist said. You'll get it, Chuck told him. I'll bring it to you tomorrow. Remember, next week, same time and same place. The specialist nodded, put his blouse and his hat back on, and walked out. A moment later, Chuck heard a car start. He went to the front of the hangar, lowered the door, and shut off the main lights, leaving only the one by the door burning. He pulled on his own blouse and cap and stepped out into the night. It was cool now, and a small breeze added to the chill. He could see the lights of downtown Vegas not far away. He slid into the driver's seat of his 1-year-old Mercury Cougar and stared at the card again. There seemed to be a small bend in one corner, but nothing else unusual. There had to be something, though. He just knew it. In the back of his mind, he realized he'd made one of the best deals of his life, even if he didn't know it yet. He started the car, turned on the lights, and drove towards the small apartment he called home. With any luck, the war would be over soon. But for tonight, he needed to sleep the best he could on the cheap mattress in the cheap frame that he hoped he could replace soon without suspicion. 0600 would come early, and he was leading the battery run. His men would expect him to be sharp, on top of his game. Once inside, Chuck put the card in a large, fireproof safe in his closet, right next to much of the cash he'd been collecting, cash he could only slowly deposit in his bank or spend without raising an alarm. Then he left and went to his current girlfriend's house, taking a couple of hundreds to give her. She often needed help with groceries and rent, and that was the least he could do. The next morning, he left her house and headed for base. That day, his unit got orders. He was headed to Vietnam. 3 weeks later, the safe, along with all the contents of the apartment, went into storage, a military facility just outside of Las Vegas that at the time was filled with the things soldiers left behind when they went to war. Chuck was in the jungle 2 weeks after that. He remained there for 3 years. He eventually learned he had a son, the product of his last few weeks spent with his girl before shipping out. He arranged an offshore trust with a tidy sum to ensure he and his mother would never want for anything. As soon as he came home from the war, he intended to retire, marry her, and move his family somewhere safe where they could live happily ever after. He never forgot the playing card and sent his son's mother a sealed envelope, asking her not to open it, but to place it with the playing card in the safe. By then, he knew what the card meant and why it was valuable. It gave him an idea, and he used cards for several things in Vietnam. In fact, it was his idea to leave them as a talisman of evil in Viet Cong villages, and his request to United States Card Company for decks of only aces of spades was approved, and thousands were shipped to units all over this godforsaken country and used to strike fear into the hearts of villagers everywhere. Some of them served a greater purpose, though, similar to that of his own Five of Spades, the one in the safe at home, accompanied by a curt message in an envelope. His will, hastily drawn up in a jungle tent by a member of JAG, instructed his son only to open that envelope if someone came looking for the card, and left everything to him via a trust his mother would control until he reached the age of 21. Chuck died on a Wednesday. He'd been headed home, finally rotating back to the States, but he went on one last mission. A sniper struck him down in a village close to the DMZ while he was providing cover to protect his men. Posthumously, he was awarded a Purple Heart, later given to the young son he had never met and his mother. Despite his passing, the use of the Ace of Spades as a harbinger of evil lived on until the war ended. The end. Thanks for listening to the Solitaire series, Episode 16, The Five of Spades. Stay tuned for the next episode in the series, The First Joker.